In the unforgiving heart of the Old West, a single act of kindness can cost you everything. This is the story of Maisie, a lone woman on the frontier who offered water to a dying man. She didn't know he was a Navajo warrior, a son of a powerful chief. The next morning, she awoke to find her isolated homestead surrounded not by friends, but by his brethren armed and silent, their faces painted for war. What happened next was not a simple tale of revenge, but a heart-stopping drama of courage, misunderstanding, and a choice that would echo across the canyons forever. The Arizona sun beat down on the small, isolated homestead with a relentless, punishing fury. It was a heat that baked the very soul that cracked the earth into a mosaic of thirsty fissures and bleached the bones of those who had misjudged its power. Here in the shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, Maisie Jenkins lived a life carved from dust and resilience. Widowed for 2 years since her husband Samuel had been taken by a fever that swept through the territory like a phantom fire, she had clung to their small patch of land with a tenacity that surprised everyone in the nearby town of Tombstone, a place more accustomed to seeing women follow their husbands to the grave or back east. Her home was a simple adobe structure, its thick walls a testament to Samuel's foresight, offering a cool respite from the midday inferno. A sturdy porch, its wood weathered to a silver gray, wrapped around the front, and from it Maisie could see for miles in every direction. The view was a breathtaking panorama of ochre desert, dotted with the stoic green of saguaro cacti, their arms raised as if in perpetual surrender to the vast cerulean sky. But the beauty was deceptive. It was a land of extremes, of sudden violent storms that could turn the dry arroyos into raging torrents of venomous creatures that sought shade in the same cool places as humans, and of men whose hearts were as hard and unforgiving as the landscape itself. Maisie was not a large woman. Her frame was slender, honed by years of hard work, her hands calloused and capable, her face framed by strands of sun-lightened brown hair that often escaped her bun, was a map of her life. The fine lines around her eyes from squinting into the sun, the determined set of her jaw, a feature that had been her mother's. But it was her eyes that held the true story. They were a startling shade of blue, the color of a mountain lake, and in their depths lay a profound loneliness, but also an unyielding strength. Her days were a rhythm of chores, a constant battle against the encroaching wilderness. She tended her small vegetable garden, coaxing life from the reluctant soil. She cared for her chickens, their clucking a comforting sound in the vast silence, and mended fences that the wind and the occasional wandering coyote seemed determined to test. Her closest companion was a scruffy dog of indeterminate breed named Jed, whose loyalty was as unwavering as the northern star. It was on a Tuesday, the air thick with the promise of a coming monsoon, that the rhythm of her life was broken. She had been returning from the well, the wooden buckets heavy in her hands, when Jed suddenly froze, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His hackles were raised, his gaze fixed on a cluster of mesquite trees near the dry creek bed that marked the edge of her property. "What is it, boy?" Maisie whispered, setting the buckets down slowly, her hand instinctively going to the small pistol that she always carried, tucked into the waistband of her skirt. Samuel had insisted. "A woman alone can't be too careful," he'd said, and the weight of the Colt, 44, was a constant heavy reminder of his absence. She followed Jed's gaze, her eyes scanning the familiar landscape. At first she saw nothing. The heat shimmered off the ground, creating mirages that danced and dissolved. Then a flicker of movement. Not the rustle of a lizard or the flight of a bird, but something larger, something human. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It could be anyone. A prospector who had lost his way. A cowboy from one of the big ranches like the one owned by John Slaughter, a man known for his own brand of justice. Or it could be trouble. The papers in Tombstone were full of stories about outlaws, renegade Apaches, and the ever-present tension between the settlers and the native tribes who had called this land home for centuries. With Jed trotting silently beside her, his growl now a low, continuous warning, Maisie moved cautiously towards the trees. She kept to the open ground, avoiding the patches of dense brush where an ambush could be laid. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the frantic beating of her own heart. As she drew closer, she saw him. He was lying on the ground, partially hidden by the thorny branches of a mesquite. He was a Navajo man, his traditional tunic torn and stained dark with blood. His long black hair was matted with dust and sweat, and his face, though contorted in pain, was etched with a fierce pride. One of his legs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a deep gash on his side was oozing blood, attracting a swarm of flies. Maisie's breath caught in her throat. She had seen death before. She had seen it in Samuel's eyes as the fever stole the life from him. But this was different. This was a man on the brink, his lifeblood seeping into the parched earth. He must have heard her approach, for his eyes fluttered open. They were as black as obsidian, and for a moment they held a flicker of defiance of warrior's fire. But then the pain washed over him, and a low groan escaped his lips. He tried to push himself up his hand, reaching for a knife that lay just beyond his grasp. But the effort was too much. He collapsed back onto the ground, his chest heaving. Maisie stood frozen, her mind racing. Every instinct, every warning she had ever heard, screamed at her to turn back, to run to her house, bar the door, and wait for this man to die. He was a Navajo, a savage as many of the folks in town would call him. The stories of raids, of stolen livestock, of brutal killings were a constant whisper on the frontier. Helping him could be seen as a betrayal. It could invite retribution from her own people, or worse, from his. But then she looked at his face, at the sheen of sweat on his brow, at the way his lips were cracked and dry. She saw not a warrior, not a savage, but a human being in agony. A man who was dying of thirst and loss of blood alone under the merciless sun. And in that moment, a different instinct took over. The one that had made her a healer in her small community back in Missouri, the one that had her sitting up all night with a neighbor's sick child, the one that saw suffering and felt an undeniable urge to alleviate it. Her heart, which had been pounding with fear, now ached with a different emotion. Compassion. She thought of Samuel, how she would have given anything for a kind stranger to offer him a sip of water in his final moments. Slowly, deliberately, she unholstered her pistol and laid it on the ground, a clear sign that she meant no harm. Jed, sensing the change in her, stopped growling, though he remained alert, his body tense. She walked back to the well and picked up one of the buckets. Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was firm. When she returned to the wounded man, his eyes were closed again. She knelt beside him, the rough fabric of her skirt scraping against the dry ground. "Water," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I have water." His eyes flickered open again this time, with a mixture of suspicion and desperation. He watched her as she dipped a clean cloth from her apron into the bucket and gently wiped the sweat and grime from his forehead. He flinched at her touch, a guttural sound coming from his throat, but he was too weak to resist. She then soaked the cloth again and held it to his lips. At first he refused, turning his head away. The pride of a warrior, even in death, was a formidable thing. "Please," she urged, her voice gentle. "It will help." She held the cloth patiently, the cool water dripping onto his parched lips. He must have tasted it, felt the life-giving moisture, because after a moment his resistance crumbled. His lips parted, and he began to suck weakly at the cloth, his eyes never leaving her face. He drank with a desperate thirst, his body trembling with the effort. When he had taken his fill, he fell back, his breathing a little easier. He looked at her, and in his dark eyes, she saw something shift. The suspicion was still there, but it was joined by a flicker of something else. Confusion. Gratitude. She couldn't be sure. She tore a strip from her petticoat, and after cleaning the wound on his side as best she could, she pressed the makeshift bandage against it, trying to staunch the bleeding. He grunted in pain, his body tensing, but he didn't fight her. She knew she couldn't move him. His leg was badly broken, and moving him could kill him. She also knew she couldn't stay with him. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The desert was a different world at night, a world of predators and unseen dangers. "I have to go," she said more to herself than to him. "But I'll leave this water for you." She placed the bucket next to him within his reach. She stood up, her legs stiff, and picked up her pistol, tucking it back into her waistband. She gave the man one last look. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. As she walked back to her house, the weight of what she had done settled upon her. She had defied the unwritten laws of the frontier. She had given aid and comfort to an enemy. She had, in the eyes of many, sided with the wilderness against civilization. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the house, every howl of a distant coyote sent a jolt of fear through her. She sat by the window, her shotgun across her lap, watching the moon cast long, eerie shadows across the desert. She thought of the man in the creek bed. Was he still alive? Had he drunk the water? Or had he succumbed to his injuries? His body now food for the scavengers of the night. A part of her prayed that he was alive. Another smaller, more fearful part prayed that he was not, because if he lived, what would happen next? Would he simply disappear back into the vast wilderness from whence he came? Or would he return? And if he did, would he come alone? The first light of dawn crept over the mountains, a soft grey light that promised another day of scorching heat. Maisie was exhausted, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep. She made her way to the kitchen and started the fire for coffee. The familiar ritual, a small comfort in the face of her uncertainty. As the water began to heat, she heard it. Jed, who had been sleeping at the foot of her bed, shot up a volley of ferocious barks, erupting from him. Maisie's blood ran cold. She grabbed her shotgun and rushed to the front door, peering through the small peephole that Samuel had drilled into the thick wood. Her heart stopped. The sight that met her eyes was her worst fear realized. Her small homestead was surrounded. A line of Navajo warriors, at least a dozen of them, sat motionless on their horses, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on her house. They were armed with rifles and bows, their bodies lean and youthful. They were not a raiding party, not a band of renegades. They were a war party, their presence a silent, terrifying declaration. And at their lead on a magnificent black stallion sat a man who could only be their chief, his face a mask of stone, his eyes holding the fate of the lone woman who had dared to give water to one of his own. The day of reckoning had come. The silence was a living thing. It pressed in on Maisie from all sides, heavier than the adobe walls of her home. Outside, the world was a frozen tableau of menace. The dozen Navajo warriors sat on their ponies as still and silent as the saguaros that dotted the landscape. They formed a loose, inescapable circle around her property, their presence an overwhelming weight. They didn't shout, they didn't charge, and they simply watched and waited. This unnerving stillness was more terrifying than any war cry. Maisie's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the heavy shotgun. Jed had fallen silent at her command, but he stood pressed against her leg, a low, continuous growl vibrating through his body. Every nerve in Maisie's body screamed at her to fire a warning shot, to make some noise to break the terrifying quiet. But she knew it would be a futile, suicidal gesture. One shot, and the silent watchers would transform into a deadly storm she could not hope to survive. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the previous day. The wounded man, the water, the bandage. Had she been a fool? A naive, sentimental woman whose compassion had just signed her own death warrant? The faces of the warriors were impassive, carved from stone, giving no clue to their intentions. Their eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to see right through the wooden door, right into her soul. The man at their head, the one on the black stallion, was clearly the leader. He was older than the others, his face a road map of a hard life lived under the sun and stars. A single eagle feather was tied in his long, grey-streaked hair, and a necklace of bear claws rested on his chest. Unlike the others who carried rifles, he held a long wooden lance decorated with feathers and beads. He sat with an unshakable dignity, his gaze fixed on her front door, with an intensity that made her feel naked and exposed. Hours crept by. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beginning its daily assault. The heat in the small house started to build. Maisie dared not light a fire, dared not even move away from her post at the door. She was a prisoner in her own home, trapped by a silent, inscrutable enemy. Her fear began to curdle into a strange, fatalistic calm. If this was to be her end, she would face it on her feet. She would not cower. From a ridge, a half-mile to the west, another pair of eyes watched the unfolding drama. Silas Croft, a rancher whose property bordered Maisie's, lowered his spyglass, a grim satisfaction twisting his thin lips. He'd disliked Samuel Jenkins for being too friendly with the Mexicans, and he disliked his widow even more for her stubborn independence. He'd seen the warriors arrive at dawn, had watched them take up their silent vigil. He knew what it meant. The Navajo were here for blood. He'd always said that Jenkins' woman was trouble. Now she'd gone and got herself into a mess that would likely get her killed. He spurred his horse not towards Maisie's homestead to offer help, but back towards Tombstone, his mind already composing the sensational story he would tell. He would be the one to bring the news, to stir the pot of fear and prejudice that simmered just beneath the surface of the town. As the sun reached its zenith, a change occurred at the besieged homestead. The leader raised his hand. It was not a signal to attack. One of the warriors dismounted and walked slowly towards the creek bed, to the very spot where Maisie had found the wounded man. He knelt, examining the ground, then picked something up. From her peephole, Maisie saw it was the blood-stained strip of her petticoat. The warrior walked back to the leader, holding the cloth out for him to see. The chief, whose name was Bako, took the piece of fabric. He looked at it for a long moment, his expression unchanging. Then he looked back at Maisie's door. He spoke a single word in his native tongue, his voice low, but carrying in the still air. In response, 2 warriors dismounted and walked towards the back of their line. They returned leading a horse, and slung across its back on a makeshift travois was a body. Maisie's heart sank. It was him, the man she had tried to help. He was dead, and they had brought him here to show her, to make her understand the price of her interference. This was a prelude to the end. They would show her the body of their fallen brother, and then they would exact their revenge. But as the horse drew closer, Maisie's eyes widened in disbelief. The man on the travois was not dead. He was propped up against a pile of blankets, his leg splinted his side, bandaged far more expertly than her own clumsy attempt. It was the same man. His eyes were open, and though he was weak, he was unmistakably alive. And he was looking directly at her house. A wave of confusion washed over Maisie, momentarily eclipsing her fear. What was happening? This wasn't revenge. This was something else, something she couldn't begin to comprehend. Chief Barco spoke again this time, a longer string of words directed at the man on the travois. The wounded warrior, whose name was Kael, responded, his voice weak but clear. He gestured with his head towards her house. Then the chief did something that stunned Maisie to her core. He dismounted. He handed the reins of his magnificent stallion to the warrior beside him, and began to walk alone and unarmed towards her front door. Jed erupted into a frenzy of barking, but Maisie barely heard him. She was mesmerized, her eyes locked on the approaching figure. The chief moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his footsteps making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He carried no weapon. His hands were open at his sides. He stopped about 20 feet from her porch. He stood there for a long moment, his dark eyes meeting hers through the tiny peephole. He was not looking at an enemy. He was looking at a person. Then he spoke. Not in his own language, but in heavily accented broken English. "Woman," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My son, he lives." Maisie was speechless. Her mind struggled to process the words, the scene, the sheer impossibility of it all. The Chief Barco gestured back towards the wounded warrior. "Kael, my son. He say, you give water." He pointed to his own mouth. "You give cloth for blood." He pointed to his side. He then took a step closer. "My son, he is a warrior. He fought the Apache who steal our horses. He was returning to us, but his horse fell. He was dying." Barco's gaze was unwavering. Warriors found him. They followed his trail. They found the trail of a white woman. They thought you had hurt him. They came for blood. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But my son," he told us. He said the white woman did not bring a knife. She brought water. She did not bring hate. She brought kindness." Maisie's hand, still gripping the shotgun, began to tremble. The fear that had held her in its icy grip for hours began to melt away, replaced by a dizzying sense of disbelief and a dawning understanding. They hadn't come for revenge. They had come to verify a story that must have seemed impossible to them, the story of a white settler who had helped a Navajo warrior instead of finishing him off. Barco then knelt down on one knee. It was not a gesture of surrender, but one of profound respect. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out something small and blue. He placed it carefully on the ground. "My son says you have the sky in your eyes," Bako said, his voice thick with an emotion Maisie couldn't name. "He says you have the heart of a sister. You gave him life. Now we do not take yours." He stood up, his gaze sweeping over her small, dusty homestead. "But your people, they will not understand this. The man with the spyglass on the hill. He will tell a different story. He will bring men with guns. They will see us, and they will see only enemies." The twist was complete. The threat was not from the Navajo warriors who surrounded her home. The true danger was from her own people, from the prejudice and fear that Silas Croft was at that very moment stoking into a wildfire in Tombstone. She had been saved by the very people she feared, only to be put in mortal danger by those she was supposed to trust. Bako turned and walked back to his horse, his movements as deliberate as before. He mounted, took his lance, and looked at her house one last time. "We will wait," he said, his voice carrying across the distance. "We will wait for the men from your town. We will see if the woman with the sky in her eyes has a people worthy of her." He then raised his lance. In unison, the dozen warriors turned their horses not away, but to face outwards, their backs now to her house. They were no longer a circle of menace. They had become a wall of protection. They were waiting for the arrival of Silas Croft and the posse from Tombstone, ready to judge the white man's justice. Maisie slowly, numbly unbarred her door and stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun hanging forgotten in her hand. The small blue object Bako had left on the ground glinted in the sun. It was a single perfectly formed turquoise stone. A gift, a symbol, a promise. She was no longer a prisoner. She was a protected queen in a fortress of her own making, surrounded by a guard of honor she had earned with a simple cup of water. And the real storm was yet to come. The sun climbed its invisible ladder in the sky, each rung another degree of blistering heat. The strange, silent standoff stretched into its third hour. The initial terror that had seized Maisie had ebbed away, leaving behind a fragile and nerve-wrackingly tense calm. She stood on her porch, the heavy shotgun now resting in the crook of her arm. It was no longer a weapon she intended to use against the men who formed a protective circle around her, but a grim statement to the ones who might be coming to save her. Her gaze drifted to the edge of the circle where Kael Chief Bako's son lay on the travois. His face was pale with fatigue and pain, but his eyes were open and alert. They were watching her. When their gazes met across the shimmering expanse of heat-baked dirt, he offered a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture so small it might have been missed, yet it was laden with a profound and complex meaning. It was an acknowledgement of their shared ordeal, a confirmation of the strange, unspoken alliance that had been forged between them with a dipper of water. Maisie felt a lump form in her throat. She nodded back, a silent promise passing between the settler and the warrior, two souls from different worlds caught together in the heart of a storm, not of their own making. The warriors themselves remained as still as statues, carved from the red rock of the canyons. Their discipline was unnerving. They did not speak. They did not shift restlessly in their saddles. They simply endured the oppressive heat, their eyes scanning the horizon, their focus absolute. Maisie could feel their collective presence as a physical weight, a silent, watchful guard. She was the center of their world, the reason for this dangerous, high-stakes gamble. Inside the relative cool of the adobe house, Jed whimpered his canine mind, unable to grasp the radical shift from menace to protection. Maisie murmured a soothing word to him, her hand resting on the weathered porch rail, her thumb tracing the grain of the wood. She clutched the small, smooth turquoise stone Barco had left for her. It was cool against her palm, a solid piece of reality in a world that had tilted off its axis. Then she saw it. On the distant horizon, a faint smudge against the brilliant blue sky. At first it was nothing more than a suspicion, a trick of the heat haze. But it grew steadily thickening and rising a churning cloud of ochre dust. Riders, many of them coming fast. The posse from Tombstone. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through Maisie's fragile calm. Her heart, which had finally found a steady rhythm, began to pound, a frantic, suffocating beat against her ribs. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift rippled through the Navajo line. Horses' snorted ears twitched, and hands that had been resting loosely now tightened on the stocks of rifles. They did not move, they did not speak, but a wave of deadly potential of coiled readiness emanated from them. Chief Barco, his back ramrod straight, watched the approaching dust cloud his face, an unreadable mask of stone. He had known they would come. This was the true test. It wasn't long before the riders were close enough to be seen clearly resolving from the dust into a posse of 20 or more men. They were a motley collection of townsfolk ranchers in dusty denims and swaggering cowboys, a chaotic assembly armed with a mix of pistols, repeating rifles, and a burning, self-righteous fury. At their head sitting, his horse with a puffed-up arrogance, was Silas Croft, his face flushed with the thrill of impending violence and self-importance. Beside him, looking far less certain, was Tombstone's town marshal, Fred White. White was a practical, cautious man, known more for his level head than his quick draw, and from the grim set of his jaw, he already looked as though he regretted letting Croft's venomous whispers whip the town into this frenzy. Silas Croft reined in his horse dramatically at the edge of Maisie's property, his eyes sweeping the scene with a triumphant proprietary glare. He saw exactly what his prejudice had prepared him to see, a helpless white woman, a lone flower of civilization surrounded by a band of bloodthirsty hostiles. He didn't see the protective circle. He saw a capture pen. "Hold your ground, men!" Croft bellowed, his voice straining with manufactured bravado, eager to play the hero. "We've got 'em cornered now. Don't let a single one of 'em slip away." He turned his gaze to Maisie, a sneer twisting his thin lips. "Don't you worry your pretty head, Mrs. Jenkins. We're here to save you." He had expected her to run towards them to collapse in grateful tears, validating his heroic charge. Instead, Maisie stood her ground, her spine rigid, her expression as hard as the desert floor. "There's no need for saving Mr. Croft," she called out, her voice astonishingly clear and steady, carrying across the tense silence that had fallen. "These men are not my enemies. You need to turn your men around and go back to town." Croft stared at her, his mouth falling open in genuine disbelief. A murmur of confusion rippled through the posse. Men exchanged uncertain glances. "What nonsense are you talking, woman?" he sputtered, his face reddening. "Have you lost your mind? They've taken you captive. Your mind's been turned by fear." "No," Maisie said, taking a brave step forward, her voice rising with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I'm not a captive. They have brought their chief's son back to me, the man I found wounded yesterday, the man I gave water to." She pointed towards Kael. "They have come in peace." Silas Croft let out a harsh, barking laugh of disbelief. "Peace? Do you call this peace?" He gestured wildly at the armed and silent warriors. "With a dozen armed savages at your door, you've been out in the sun too long, Mrs. Jenkins." His voice dropped, becoming conspiratorial, poisonous. He leaned forward in his saddle, speaking to the men around him as much as to her. "Or maybe you're one of them now. An Indian lover." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. It was designed to isolate her, to strip her of her identity, and cast her out. Several men in the posse shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. But others nodded in slow, dawning agreement, their own faces hardening. The simple, righteous narrative of a heroic rescue was being complicated by a woman who refused to play her part, and they didn't like it. Marshal White urged his horse forward, his eyes scanning the scene with a practiced, analytical gaze. He was a lawman, not a vigilante, and the situation stank. He saw the impassive faces of the Navajo. He saw the way they held their weapons ready, but not aimed. He saw the wounded man on the travois, and he saw Maisie standing alone, defiant and unafraid. Something didn't add up. "Hold on, Silas," White said, his voice calm but layered with authority. "Let the lady speak." He turned his full attention to Maisie, offering her a sliver of legitimacy. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me exactly what's going on here. Start from the beginning, if you please." With the marshal's steady gaze upon her, Maisie recounted the story. She spoke of finding Kael near death, of the simple act of giving him water. She described waking to find herself surrounded, her initial terror, and then Chief Barco's slow, deliberate approach. As she spoke, Silas Croft interrupted repeatedly, scoffing and sneering. "It's a trick, a Navajo lie." "Can't you see it, Marshal? They're just waiting for a chance to kill us all." "But Marshal..." White listened, his focus unwavering. His eyes never leaving Maisie's face. He saw the truth there, clear and bright as the sky in her eyes. He saw the small turquoise stone she clutched in her hand. When she finished speaking, a heavy silence fell once more over the sun-scorched land. The marshal turned his gaze from Maisie to the Navajo chief. He addressed him not as a savage, but as a man. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice even and respectful. "You came in peace." Chief Barco looked not at the marshal, but at Silas Croft. His eyes, dark and deep as a canyon at midnight, were filled with a old ancient contempt for the noisy, posturing man. Then he turned his regal gaze back to Marshal White. He nodded once, a gesture of profound gravity. "We came to see the woman with the sky in her eyes," he said, his English slow and deliberate, each word chosen with care. "We did not come for war." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the posse, his voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its power. "But we will not run from it." The challenge was unmistakable. The choice lay with the white men. Silas Croft, seeing his moment of glory and righteous vengeance slipping away, decided to force the issue. His face was mottled with rage and wounded pride. "He's lying, Marshal. They're laughing at you, at all of us. Are we going to let these heathens dictate terms to us on our own land? I say we string 'em up." He kicked his horse violently, surging forward, his eyes wild. He raised his rifle, aiming it not just at the chief, but at the very idea of peace, at the possibility of a different outcome. "For the white folk of Arizona," he screamed, a madman, crowning himself king. It happened in an instant of terrible, suspended clarity. Before Croft could fire, before the marshal could physically intervene, a blur of motion erupted from the Navajo line. One of the younger warriors, his face a mask of fierce indignation, raised his own rifle and fired. But he wasn't aiming at Croft. The shot was precise, deliberate. The bullet splintered the top of the wooden porch rail, not 3 inches from where Maisie stood, showering her skirt with wooden fragments. It wasn't an act of aggression. It was a warning shot, a defiant cry, a visceral rejection of Croft's provocation. But in the trigger-happy tension of the moment, it was all the excuse the posse needed. A shot had been fired. The distinction of its intent was lost in a wave of collective panic and bloodlust. "They're attacking!" Someone screamed the words a spark in a powder keg. Chaos erupted. The world dissolved into a deafening, hellish roar of rifles and pistols. The posse, a disorganized and panicked mob, began firing wildly their shots, kicking up dust around the Navajo ponies. The Navajo, in stark contrast, returned fire, not as a scattered volley, but with the deadly, calculated precision of seasoned warriors. They used their horses for cover firing, and then moving their targets the most aggressive of the white riders. Maisie screamed a raw, desperate sound torn from her throat and dove to the splintery planks of the porch as bullets whizzed over her head, thudding into the thick adobe walls of her home. Jed barked frantically from inside his fear, a mirror of her own. The fragile dream of a peaceful resolution had been shattered into a nightmare of smoke, blood, and the thunder of guns. Marshal White, caught in the crossfire, roared for his men to cease fire, but his voice was swallowed by the cacophony. He saw Silas Croft, his face a mask of manic glee, firing his pistol indiscriminately into the fray. The situation was spiraling into a massacre, one that would stain the territory with blood for years to come. Then through the chaos, Chief Bako acted. He let out a piercing war cry, a sound that cut through the gunfire like a razor's edge. It was not a call to attack, but a command. In response, his warriors as one suddenly broke formation, their movements fluid and instantly coordinated. They didn't retreat. Half of them charged forward, not at the main body of the posse, but towards the flanks, letting out fierce cries that drew the posse's fire, forcing the white men to turn their attention and break their line. The other half, including Bako himself, wheeled their horses around, forming a moving, living wall between the raging battle and Maisie's house. With breathtaking efficiency, they grabbed the reins of the horse, carrying the wounded Kael, pulling him to safety behind their protective screen. It was a brilliant, selfless maneuver. In the midst of a battle, they had not started. Their primary objective was still to protect the woman who had shown them kindness. Maisie, peering through the porch rails, watched in horrified awe. She saw a cowboy clutch his chest and fall from his horse, his rifle clattering to the ground. She saw a Navajo warrior slump over, sliding from his pony like a discarded doll, a dark stain spreading across the back of his tunic. The cost of her one small act of compassion was being paid in blood, tallied in bodies right before her eyes. Marshal White, finally seeing an opening in the chaos, rode his horse directly into Silas Croft's path, grabbing the reins with a powerful wrench. "That's enough, Croft," he roared, his face livid with a fury that eclipsed Croft's madness. "You started this. I'm holding you responsible for every man, white or red, who dies here today." He drew his own pistol, the big Colt Peacemaker, and fired it once straight into the air. The loud, authoritative crack of the lawman's gun momentarily silenced the chaos. "Cease fire!" he bellowed, his voice, the voice of the law itself, finally cutting through the battle-crazed madness. "I said, cease fire, damn you all." Slowly, hesitantly, the shooting sputtered and died down. The air, thick and heavy with gun smoke, hung with the metallic smell of blood and the bitter scent of fear. In the sudden ringing silence, the only sounds were the groans of the wounded, the panicked whinnying of horses, and the frantic, hopeless beating of Maisie's own heart. The battle had lasted only a few minutes, but the landscape and every soul upon it was changed forever. The ground between the two groups was a no-man's land, littered with the terrible price of hatred and misunderstanding. Maisie slowly got to her feet, her dress stained with dust, her ears ringing. She looked out at the carnage, at the men lying still or writhing on the ground, both white and Navajo. Her heart felt as though it had been ripped from her chest and stomped into the dirt. This was her fault, all of it. Her simple act of kindness had led inexorably to this. The turquoise stone felt heavy in her hand, no longer a symbol of hope, but a weight of guilt pulling her down into a sea of profound and bottomless despair. The world returned not in a rush, but in a slow, agonizing wave of sensation. The first thing to pierce the deafening roar in Maisie's ears was a man's low groan, a sound of pure animal pain that seemed to anchor the floating chaos. The air, thick and metallic, stung her nostrils with the acrid stench of burnt black powder. A heavy shroud of gun smoke hung low to the ground, its ghostly tendrils weaving through the legs of terrified horses and around the still forms of the fallen. Through the haze, the bright, indifferent Arizona sun glinted cruelly off spent shell casings that littered the ground like scattered brass tears. Marshal Fred White materialized from the smoke, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He moved with a speed that belied his size, grabbing Silas Croft by the collar and hauling him half off his horse. "You're under arrest, Croft," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut through the nearest moans. "For incitement for murder. We'll figure out the full list when we're scraping your friends off the ground." Croft, his face now the color of tallow, his bravado vanished like a desert mirage, began to stammer, his eyes wide with a coward's panic. But the marshal's glare was a physical force silencing him completely. Maisie pushed herself up from the dusty porch boards, moving as if through deep water. A profound emptiness had hollowed her out, leaving only a dull, throbbing ache. She stepped over the splintered wood of her porch rail, her boots landing softly in the dirt, and her gaze swept across the devastating tableau. Before her lay not two sides, not a posse and warriors, but simply broken bodies. The angry, shouting faces from moments before were now slack with shock or contorted in agony. The labels of settler and savage had been blasted away, leaving only the terrible unifying truth of human suffering. There was no us and them anymore. There was only pain. Her eyes fell on a young cowboy, a boy she'd seen in town, barely old enough to grow a proper beard. He was propped against a wagon wheel, his hand pressed futilely against a bleeding wound in his shoulder, his face pale with shock. Moving on instinct, Maisie knelt beside him, placing her own hand over his, applying steady pressure. His eyes, wide with fear, met hers. He didn't see an Indian lover. He saw a lifeline. Then her gaze lifted, drawn across the deadly, sun-baked space. A Navajo warrior was trying to sit up, his movements stiff with agony. His hand was clutched to his side, the very same spot where she had first bandaged Kael. The symmetry of it was a physical blow, a twist of fate so cruel it stole her breath. Without a second thought, without a moment of hesitation, she tore another long, clean strip from her petticoat. A fresh murmur of shock and anger rippled through the nearest members of the posse. A man with a bandaged arm spat on the ground, his eyes burning with hate. She felt their stares like a brand on her skin, but she ignored them. Their world of blame and retribution had ceased to exist for her. She rose and walked deliberately into the no-man's land, each step a conscious choice. The world seemed to hold its breath. She walked past the still lifeless body of a fallen Navajo, her heart clenching with a grief so sharp it felt like a knife wound. She knelt in the dust beside the wounded warrior. He flinched his hand, instinctively moving toward his knife, his eyes wide with a mix of suspicion and pain. He expected a finishing blow. Instead, she held out the white strip of cloth. "For the bleeding," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her soul. He stared at the offering, then at her face. He saw no malice, no triumph. He saw only a reflection of his own pain, a shared humanity in her sky-blue eyes. After a long, silent moment, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He reached out and took the cloth, his calloused fingers brushing against hers, for a fleeting instant. That single quiet act of compassion did what Marshal White's gun and all his authority could not. It broke the spell of hatred. It was a bridge built across a river of blood, a fragile span of grace in a landscape of brutality. From his position on the Black Stallion, Chief Barco watched the entire exchange. His stoic mask remained, but a flicker of profound, undeniable respect shone in his ancient eyes. This woman, who had every reason to hate them, to celebrate their losses, was instead tending to them. She was not of their tribe, nor of the tribe of her own violent people. She stood alone, a beacon of a different, more difficult way. He had seen what he needed to see. He raised his hand, not in aggression, but in a quiet, final signal to his men. He was done here. He turned his stallion, and without a backward glance, led his remaining warriors away. Their movements were imbued with a somber dignity. They paused only to retrieve their fallen, lifting them with a gentleness that belied their fierce reputation. They vanished back into the vast, indifferent desert that had spawned them, leaving behind not a victory or a defeat, but a silence heavy with shame, regret, and the faintest glimmer of awe. The posse, now a subdued and broken group of men, finally began to tend to their earlier fury replaced by a grim exhaustion. Marshal White, after securing Croft to his own saddle, organized the grim task of collecting the casualties. He watched as Maisie moved among the wounded, helping the town's doctor, a man named Goodfellow, who had ridden with them, his face a study in professional focus. She cleaned wounds, offered water from her own well, and spoke words of comfort. Her touch gentle. Her presence a calming balm in the chaotic aftermath. Later, as the sun began to dip, casting long, sorrowful shadows, the marshal approached her. She was sitting on her porch steps, her dress stained with dirt and blood, her face streaked with tears that had finally come. "Mrs. Jenkins," White said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. "What you did today, first by helping that boy yesterday, and then by walking out there, it was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Maisie looked up, her blue eyes seeming to hold all the sorrow of the day. She just shook her head slowly. "It shouldn't have happened, Marshal. None of it." "No, it shouldn't have," he agreed, his gaze falling on the humiliated Silas Croft. "Fear and hate are a poison, the worst kind. Today we all drank it down deep." He looked back at her, his expression softening with a hard-won respect. "But you," he said, the words coming from a place of genuine conviction, "you offered water instead." The days that followed were a trial of a different kind. The story of the Jenkins homestead shootout spread through Tombstone like a fever. Silas Croft's version, a wild tale of a savage ambush and a traitorous woman who had sided with them, was championed by some who saw the world in the simple, stark terms of white and red. But Marshall White's official report, backed by the sober testimony of Dr. Goodfellow and a few other shame-faced but honest men from the posse, told a different story. It spoke of Croft's reckless agitation and of a lone woman's impossible courage. The town of Tombstone was divided. Some shunned her completely. When she rode in for supplies, they would cross the street to avoid her, their faces hard masks of judgment. The words "Indian lover" were muttered just loud enough for her to hear. Her fence was cut one night, her chickens were stolen the next. But others, a quiet and growing number, looked at her with a new respect. They saw not a traitor, but the embodiment of a conscience they wished they'd had. Baskets of fresh bread, jars of preserves, and clutches of eggs began to appear on her porch. Men who had once ignored her would now offer a slow, silent nod as she passed, a gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than any words. Maisie never saw Kyle or Chief Barco again. Their world remained separate from hers, but the connection forged in blood and water endured. Sometimes, in the pearly light of dawn, she would find a freshly killed rabbit or a small, carefully tied pouch of medicinal herbs left on the large, flat rock near the creek bed. And on the anniversary of the shootout, every year, without fail, a single perfectly formed blue turquoise stone would appear on her porch rail, identical to the one she now wore on a leather cord around her neck, resting coolly against her skin. She stayed on her homestead, her life forever changed. The profound loneliness was still a part of the landscape of her heart, but it was different now. It was the quiet of solitude, not the ache of isolation. It was tempered by the deep, unshakable knowledge that she was part of a larger, more complex world than she had ever imagined. She had looked into the face of raw, primal fear and had chosen compassion. She had stood between two worlds on the brink of mutual annihilation, and for a few terrifying moments had held them together. Her small adobe house was no longer just a home. It was a landmark. It was a testament to the fact that even in the harshest of lands, under the most brutal of suns, a single act of kindness could echo forever a quiet but persistent challenge to the endemic violence of the frontier. The woman with the sky in her eyes had survived not by the gun, but by the unyielding, inexplicable strength of her heart. The story of Maisie Jenkins is more than just a tale from the Old West. It's a powerful reminder that our choices define us, and that true courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about acting with compassion in spite of it. In a world that often urges us to build walls, Maisie's story shows the strength it takes to build a bridge. Her legacy, written not in history books, but in the quiet respect of those who knew the truth, teaches us that even the smallest act of kindness can change the world. If this story of bravery, misunderstanding, and ultimate redemption moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more true dramas from the heart of history. Your support allows us to keep telling these important stories.